This is Radio Health Journal. I'm Reed Pence. This week, how the pandemic affects brain development of new infants.
There's a lot of evidence that early growth motor behavior can actually be indicative of longer-term developmental and cognitive outcomes.
So what are we going to be able to do about it when Radio Health Journal returns?
I'm Nancy Benson, host of Radio Health Journal. If you enjoy listening to Radio Health Journal, you'll also like our sister show, Viewpoints, which covers a wide array of topics from education to history to the environment. Here's a preview of what they're covering this week on Viewpoints.
If you only ever read about a violin and had never heard one played, do you have an adequate education in violin?
Finding more opportunities for active learning rather than passive. Then,
if it had not been for Watergate, the horrible mistake he made with Watergate, he would be considered one of our better presidents for what he did with the environment.
We explore the lasting legacies of former presidents. I'm Marty Peterson.
and I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth this week on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
Listen to Viewpoints on your favorite radio station and subscribe and listen to shows anytime on Apple Podcasts and Google Play.
The pandemic has thrown most of us off balance, but while most of us have been able to navigate a new normal, we may have forgotten about the newest members of our society. The children conceived and born into a world that stands 6 feet apart are at a time in their new lives when human touch is necessary. How can they learn facial expressions when smiles are hidden behind a mask? This may be a new normal, but the pandemic's effects on child development are anything but. It's molding the minds of our children, and not for the better.
I talked to a parent of a toddler today who brought her son to Target for the first time when he was 18 months old. And he waved to a mannequin, and she had this aha moment of, oh my gosh, my son doesn't recognize that that's not a real person. And she hadn't even realized that she hadn't brought him along to the store. So because of the pandemic and health concerns, we've changed what kids are being exposed to in our environment.
That's Dr. Rebecca Jackson, Vice President of Programs and Outcomes for Brain Balance, a non-medical program that builds and strengthens brain activity. She's also a board-certified cognitive specialist. Through her work, she's noticed the pandemic impacting kids' social, emotional functioning and causing a drop in gross and motor skills, an observation confirmed by a recently published study in the journal Nature.
Early infant development measurements are showing lower than what we expect for infants at 6 months of age. Some of the areas that we're seeing an impact in that particular research was looking at gross motor, fine motor, and communication elements in infants. Two of our biggest drivers with development are our sensory experiences and our motor movement. And what we're seeing, if I think back to when my kids were little, I was dragging them along with me to the grocery store and runs to Target and the post office and whatever life needed to have happen that day, my kids came along. And parents aren't doing that right now.
Which Dr. Morgan Feierstein, a co-author of the study, says could be the reason for the lower test scores. Feierstein is a postdoctoral research fellow in psychiatry at Columbia University Medical Center. One other theory suggests the effects of the pandemic start before the baby's even born.
There is a very long and well-documented history of studies that have found, for example, natural disasters such as snowstorms, hurricanes, or famines, and even periods of war can have long-term neurodevelopmental impacts on children who are born during and immediately following those events. And though it really varies from study to study, it does seem that maternal stress during pregnancy can contribute to those observed developmental changes. And so I think that because of our historical knowledge of that potential, I think we have to consider maternal stress as one of the possible mechanisms.
But Feierstein says more research is needed to know exactly what's affecting child development. Aspects such as motor skills are helping Feierstein find the answers.
Motor skills are a really important early indicator for pediatricians, developmental psychologists, and clinicians. There's a lot of evidence that early gross motor behavior can actually be indicative of longer-term developmental and cognitive outcomes. So it could just be that that's sort of an early indicator that we can use. In terms of why are we seeing these differences, we don't know, is the short answer. We certainly are interested in trying to understand more about what may have changed over the last few years for infants who were born during the pandemic, whether it be due to changes in their environment for social distancing and COVID-19 precautions, differences in how they're interacting with strangers, with other family members. Are they interacting with other infants at the same age, or are they just not having those exposures? And at the moment, that's something that we are actively trying to get at more closely.
At first, Feierstein wondered if the cause might be due to the COVID-19 infection itself. However, only about half of the study participants were mothers who tested positive for COVID during their pregnancy. The other half did not.
We thought that at first there could actually be some potential viral effect. So there are some viruses, maybe most notably the Zika virus, that are able to cross the placenta during pregnancy. And unfortunately, these can directly affect a baby's brain development. Fortunately, we now have a lot of evidence that SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, most likely cannot cross the placenta. And so the virus is unlikely to directly impact brain development and function. And that's probably why we're not seeing any developmental differences between those infants born to mothers who did have a COVID-19 infection compared to those who did not.
Since debunking that theory, Feierstein and other researchers are investigating the relation between stress caused by the pandemic and child development in the womb. COVID-19 added extra pressure to many groups of people, like new moms who had to worry about themselves and a new baby. Casey Bader, for example, struggled to balance the emotions of growing a new life inside her for the very first time, while fearing that a positive COVID test could affect her unborn child.
You don't know what's going to happen. Are you going to get sick with COVID and have to deliver with a mask on or by yourself? Are you going to get sick with COVID? How is that going to affect the baby? A lot of mothers were losing the pregnancy whenever they got sick with COVID. And so that fear is just constantly playing in your mind. Anytime you go out into public or go to a family friend gathering or step outside of your house, you don't have yourself to worry about anymore. You have this unborn child in your womb that you are responsible for from the moment of conception. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of added pressure and stress on my shoulders to stay healthy and take care of my now son, Jude.
For both Bader and her boyfriend, the pregnancy was as unexpected as the pandemic. The couple hunkered down for the summer in a beach town in North Carolina.
That summer, we found out that we were pregnant, and we were kind of like, okay, what are we going to do? We're in the middle of a pandemic, we're going to be parents in a pandemic. Like, how do we navigate this? And so we decided to keep the pregnancy. We moved back to St. Louis when I was about 6 months pregnant, and I kind of just stayed inside a lot of the time.
That's something many of us did too, but as her baby grew in isolation, Bader's pregnancy felt lonelier than she'd imagined.
I think pregnancy is a pretty independent experience in and of itself. No one else is pregnant but you. But I think I felt a little bit extra isolated because of all of the quarantine mandates, the social distancing. I had to go to doctor's appointments alone. But yeah, with the isolation, it definitely made me feel more alone. And I think it even played a role in postpartum depression for me. My job went remote, so I work from home now. And I just think, for me, I'm an extrovert, and spending a lot of time in the house is just not good, not good for me. So I'm working from home. It was a pandemic. There's all of these regulations, and being a mom on top of all of that, it's just extremely isolating.
And all of these emotions also affect her child, an idea Jackson believes moms should realize but not feel guilty about.
Every aspect of development is so highly complex. So the mom, how she's feeling and functioning and her level of health during pregnancy can have an impact on that developing baby. So when you look at stress hormones, if you look at cortisol and our adrenal responses, all of those stress responses have an impact on our body. And if you're pregnant, it has an impact on that fetus, that developing baby as well. Clearly, this is not the first catastrophic event that's had an impact on pregnant moms' stress or an environment. I mean, if we look at World War II or Hiroshima or any of these major events, the impact is there.
But Feierstein says there is time to fix it. Small changes can make a big impact in your child's development.
As a developmental psychologist, I am optimistic because we know that infants' brains are extremely plastic. That's a word we use a lot in developmental psychology. So they are plastic, they're malleable, which means that they can respond very readily to changes in their environment. So we are really encouraging parents during this time, and really all of the time, even outside of the context of a pandemic, to talk to their baby as much as possible, sing with their baby, physical contact with their baby. Those are all things that are really going to just let them practice all of these skills a little bit more.
What I love about development is some of the simplest, most powerful things for a young developing infant or child are things that we can do from home. So knowing that it's important to find ways and opportunities for safe and healthy exposure for our kids. So taking them outside and finding different parks to go to, taking your kids along to the grocery store where there's not a lot of close proximity to other people, finding those opportunities to expose your kids to different faces, different environments, different sights and sounds and smells is all important, and it is a key aspect of development that we're able to have an impact on if we know to be thinking about it and doing it.
As a working mom, Bader's grateful to a woman from her church who runs an in-home daycare. There, her son is able to play with other kids his age, and when they're home, Bader keeps him going with stimulating activities like flashcards. Bader's son is on track for all of his milestones, proof the pandemic doesn't control our children's lives. Feierstein says that, yes, these findings of slower child development are concerning, but more research needs to be done before we jump to any conclusions.
So I think it's really important to emphasize that these differences between the groups that we find, they're small. But when we think about this on the scale of millions of babies having been born during the pandemic now, that's when we start to think about potential larger ramifications on sort of a public health scale. This was an early study. It was the first to look at this particular outcome in the context of the pandemic. And it's a small study, so it's about 300 mother-infant dyads. Importantly, we had very few severe cases of COVID-19 in our sample. And we also had very few cases of COVID-19 during the first trimester of pregnancy. So in order to really understand the effects of the wider spectrum of COVID-19 infection on infant outcomes, we absolutely need our colleagues to replicate our work and hopefully have more severe cases and also first trimester cases so that we can really more adequately evaluate this effect.
You can find out more about all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer this week is Kristen Farah. I'm Reed Pence. Coming up next week on Radio Health Journal.
Perhaps we could transition from pandemic to endemic. That is, a truce that we have with this virus.
Why experts think Omicron could end the pandemic.
Then how one Colorado school district is combating sleep deprivation for students and parents.
Teachers definitely notice students falling asleep in class. Students themselves notice it, especially in those first couple of periods in the morning.
All that and more on Radio Health Journal.
And that's Radio Health Journal for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more. And check Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify for a library of past programs. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and information about our guests at radiohealthjournal.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Radio Health Journal.